Welcome to the Best Fleets podcast, brought to you by the team that operates the Best Fleets to Drive For, the only North American-wide workplace recognition program in the trucking industry. My name is Chris Henry, and I am honored to be the host of this new podcast. Just like the Best Fleets program, our objective is to provide our viewers and listeners with a gentle nudge towards continuous improvement. Although we can't control who those viewers and listeners are or will be in the future, we expect the vast majority to work in the trucking industry and may hold positions from the driver's seat all the way up to the C-suite. This monthly podcast will provide a roadmap for how to become a best fleet, and those necessary steps are going to have nuance to them. Further, our hope is that our viewers and listeners will take at least one action item from every episode, a gentle nudge, if you will, to becoming their own version of a best fleet. Okay, so let's get into it. For our first two episodes, which was really one engaging conversation split into two, we are pleased to have a dynamic duo provide the proper intro and context to everything best fleets. Jazrawy and Mark Murrell founded CarriersEdge over 15 years ago, and it has grown every year since. In late 2007, Jane and Mark observed a glaring lack of workplace recognition programs in the trucking industry. And after many iterations, discussions, and presentations, Best Fleets was born, and the rest is history. In this episode, we're not going to spend too much time discussing the history, but we do want to highlight the why of the program. And that's going to be something that we reference in every episode. We don't just want to provide the what, the outcome. We want to provide the why. In addition, and more importantly, we will take a retrospective look at this year's edition of Best Fleets. Enjoy. Oh,
right.
Well, Mark, Jane, welcome to the podcast. So it kind of feels weird welcoming you to it because it's our podcast, but nevertheless, welcome. So just to start off with, for our viewers and listeners that don't know too much about Best Fleets to Drive For, would you mind, just doing a tiny additional bio on yourselves, and then a little bit about Best Fleets, where it came from and where it's gotten to.
Okay, so I'm Jazrawy. Bio. What do you want? I'm the CEO of CarriersEdge. I'm the co-founder of the Best Fleets to Drive For program. I have been in the training business since the early 90s. So that's a long time. You can do the math. And specifically in trucking, well, actually, go back a bit. When Mark and I met, we started a company in 2000. So after that, for about 15 years in trucking. But I have been writing courses for people and creating online versions of things for years and years and years. Too long. How's that for an intro?
All right.
And I'm a super interesting person.
For sure.
Beyond that.
I'm Mark Murrell, the other co-founder of CarriersEdge, and I'm not an interesting person.
So we match.
I do all the work that Jane doesn't want to do, or doesn't get to because she's doing content or whatever.
I'm trying to figure out hours of service regulations.
So the Best Fleets to Drive For program was a perfect example of that, because it was an idea or an observation that Jane made a long time ago now in 2008, that the other best employer programs never included any trucking companies, or more accurately, trucking companies never participated in any of those best employer programs. But they also were having a lot of issues finding drivers, a lot of labor crunch situation happening. So it seemed to be a real disconnect that everybody knows there's a labor crunch, but nobody is recognizing the good employers or sharing the things that work or doing the things that we know will bring more people into the industry. So Jane recognized that, brought it into my office, and sort of threw a magazine on my desk and said, "There's no trucking companies here. We need to do something about that," and then left. So
it was a little longer than that.
Yeah, there was a bit more of a rant in there about that. And I was like, okay, this is a good observation. And if trucking companies aren't going to participate in the existing programs, then maybe we should start one that is specific to the industry and capture the general elements of a great workplace, but then take it a step further and add in some things that are specific to the industry. And so with that, the idea for Best Fleets to Drive For was born. And we partnered with Truckload Carriers Association in the summer of 2008 and launched the first edition of the program. And the rest, they say, is history or misery, I guess, depending on how you spell it. But that's the brief history of the program.
Awesome. And I've been lucky to be involved. This is my first year of Best Fleets, being part of the Best Fleets team as well as the CarriersEdge team. And, for our viewers, we actually conceived of this podcast, months ago, and we actually put a pause on it because it just didn't feel right. And part of that was I hadn't myself completed my first season of Best Fleets, doing the scoring, the interviews, that kind of stuff. And I think as a result of that, the content's going to be much better. And one of the things that I believe it was Jane brought up in our discussions after we put a pause on the podcast back in the fall was, what we were talking about, why it came to be, why Best Fleets came to be. And she used the phrase, it was a gentle nudge. So a gentle nudge towards progressive. It started off as HR practices, but it's gone way beyond that. It's operational strategy, all these kind of things. And then through our after our interviews, we were talking to one of the carriers that participated, and they actually said this is the main tool they use to benchmark all their programs, services, and a lot of their strategies. And that gentle nudge captures it. You can't push a trucker to do anything. You have to give them some ideas and let them think about it and move on from there. So that's what we're hoping to do with this podcast over the next 12 months, a gentle nudge to show you, the viewer, the listener, what, not too hard, what it takes to become a Best Fleet. So
I'd like to add just a comment into that about the idea of the gentle nudge is, there's a lot to that because we don't want to tell anybody what to do. All we're trying to do with this program is capture the things that already seem to be working. It's less about saying you should be doing this or that, because everybody's got their own business. Everybody has their own way of doing things and their own culture and all of that sort of thing. What we want to do with this program is say, hey, this guy over here is having success with something. It might be worth having a look at. Or this person over here has tried this thing and it actually worked well for them. So it's really more about collecting and communicating ideas. And people will take some of those things and ignore some other ones, or maybe try some things and it doesn't work for them. And that's all fine. That's all part of that continuous improvement of recognizing that there's a lot of different things out there and you've got to figure out the ones that are going to be a good fit for your organization. So the nudge that sort of comes from that is more about saying, look, there's a lot of things out there, and any problem that you're having, somebody else is probably having that and may have a solution for it, or may have tried some things that could be useful. We've got a lot of examples of fleets that have done that, like taken ideas from other people and just adapted it to their own. So maybe somebody tried something and they thought, okay, well, this could work if we tweaked it a little bit for us. We'll do a little bit of this and it'll work for us. And it has worked really nicely. So that's really what we see and find very fulfilling about the program. We love seeing that kind of thing.
And to go back further, one of the things about training and that I've learned through, because way back in the day, I would do training for people to go from system to system. So they would go to a large company that was using some sort of accounting system, let's say. And my job was to basically teach them the new system. And what I learned was that when people are forced to change rapidly, they get really angry. They don't like it. They're afraid. They think people are pushing things on them. They haven't been included in the consultation process. There's just a lot of things that really, really tick them off. So what we do with a gentle nudge, and it's funny because you've attributed that to me, but I don't really remember saying it. But it's the approach that I've taken for a couple of decades now, is that, you can't, if you push people too hard, they're going to respond negatively. Mm-hmm. And trucking as an industry, since the program started, has gone through such immense amounts of change. And I talk about this every time I talk about the Best Fleets, is that trucking has had a bunch of technology completely just dumped on them. The trucks are different. The dispatch systems are different. Their safety systems, the scorecard, like ever since 2007, when we started the program, which was not, in hindsight, that was a tough year to do it. But so much has changed over those past years. So I guess we're in the 14th year of the program, or the 13th?
13th year.
13th year. And like so many things have changed. And trucking has taken it pretty much in stride now. They're starting to get used to that whole process of change. And Best Fleets is a mechanism that they can measure the effects of the changes that they're implementing into their own companies on the people around them, not just the drivers, the other staff that are involved. So change is a nasty, nasty process for humans. And, we don't like it. Our brains get set into a certain path that they don't like moving out of because it takes energy. And so, trying to grapple with all of that and grappling as a leader with all of that change is a real challenge. So I think Best Fleets is helpful with that, because people can think about can use the Best Fleets as a framework to look at how their company is coping, really, and coping with the different challenges. And this year is a whole new challenge. So, of which we shall not speak. And that's kind of where we found the success. And it's really the fleets who have been making it a success rather than us making it a success, I think.
Well, no, it was a great experience for me. It's actually been one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in my life over the last 6 months, being part of this. And a lot of it, I was worried about the process, because I know how difficult it is to benchmark companies based on quantitative results. I just couldn't conceive of how we did it with qualitative results, open text. And the process I can verify is legit. It's rigorous. It's defensible. It's one word that came up quite a bit during the process. And one of the things that, now that I understand the system, I just don't know why a carrier would not be participating in this program. There's no barrier to entry other than, time, and obviously the big one is commitment. I just don't understand why they wouldn't use this as a tool. But we can't push anybody. It's a gentle nudge. So
no, they've got to do it when they're ready. It's the same thing we say about adopting e-learning. And it's the analogy of smoking. You can't do it until you're ready. Unless you're ready to quit smoking, it never works. And unless you're ready to adopt e-learning, you're never going to have success with it. And the same thing here. If you're not ready to really go through that effort of compiling all that information, and we don't make it easy for people, and we make it harder every year. And we make no bones about that. It's going to be a miserable grind the first time you go through it. It sucks. And we kind of reveled in that a little bit, because that's part of the process and part of the rigor of the thing. But if you're not ready to go through that and then really take seriously the results that you get back, there's no point in doing it. Why spend all that time if you're not ready to look at all of the information? The people that do well are the people that go through the process, look at the information, compare it to others, see where they can make improvements, and make that sort of ongoing adjustment. The people that come into it just hoping to get a logo to put on their trucks never end up doing very well.
Yeah, and some of the fleets who have been on, one of the fleets who's been on the longest right now, consecutively, and I've talked to a couple of carriers who have done this, is that they don't actually, they kind of watch the program for a couple of years and then they do it, which I think is a really interesting approach. Instead of going, okay, we're going to win this thing. What is it? Let me see. They actually talk to other people who've been through the program, find out what's on the questionnaire, come to one of our webinars or, something else that we're doing, and sort of get the lay of the land. And I think that's a really good approach to sort of see what other people think of it. So I think what'll be really cool for you as you kind of go on your little podcast journey is you get to talk to some of the best fleets about, their experiences rather than just talking to us about ours.
The miserable grind that we talk about for fleets is certainly matched by the headache that we go through and the mountain of work that we have to go through. So we told you in the beginning,
mountain of work is like your catchphrase for best fleets.
It is.
It's a mountain of work.
You got to climb that mountain all the time.
Yeah.
And we told you that it was going to be something like that in the beginning. And I'm not sure that you really, that you could visualize
Chris
what was
didn't
involved.
believe us.
No.
He thought,
So,
no problem.
now that you've been in it, what's your experience? What's your thoughts on that part of it?
From the process point of view, I always previously approached the problem that there was a way to automate certain things, and that was a cognitive bias, I guess. And I had the thought process, there must be some way to smooth this out, but you can't cheat. You have to get into it. And that's why I think the pause was great. Going through the process, now I know the different topics, how people respond, how people on the flip side don't respond. So yeah, there's
the bad behavior and the good behavior.
Yeah, the sore losers in some cases. People that scored well didn't quite make it, to the finals, or the get named a winner, and then there's no response from them, even though in 2 years they could get to that point. So Mark talked about in a recent article about the 3 traits or ways to become a best fleet. One of them was a commitment. And when people now ask me, what do we have to do to become or be recognized as best fleet, I reiterate the commitment piece. You have to treat this as a multi-year commitment. You're going to make minor changes each year, or perhaps major if you have a lot of resources to put, in terms of your continuous improvement. But that's the number one thing, is the commitment, but more importantly, the executive commitment. So it has to come from the top. So we had one CEO who I interviewed. He had no idea about the questionnaire. So he was operating blind when I did the interview. So I had to inform him, for the most part, here's what you answered. And if he would have had a chance to complete part of that questionnaire, I believe they would have been, very close to, the winner's circle, the top 20. So that was a learning experience for him.
But that's not, that it happens all the time. And actually there was one year, a few years ago, where I actually stopped the interview and said, okay, because the CEO or the president, I can't remember the actual title, but he was like, no, that's not right. And I said, do you want to go back and actually do this again? Because we can just schedule another interview. Like you guys go off and figure it out, and then we'll come back to it. It happens all the time where people figure it's just filling out a form, and it's not filling out a form. You're trying to describe your vision for your company. And I wouldn't, if it was me who was filling out a best employer type of survey, I would not want to be leaving it to the lowest paid employee in my company. No. That's something, it's leadership that needs to be there, because they need to be able to describe or talk about, kind of embody the vision of what am I trying to do here? What is my goal? What is the company objectives? So yeah, it's what else? Well, actually, he didn't finish, so we should let him.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, no, and the flip side is, I think a situation like that, they get one chance at it, so they get a pass for the first year. They don't know what's going on. But if they do that consistently, it's less about that situation and more about their culture. And you can pick those. Now I can pick those people out. So in my past, I would observe this kind of behavior, but I didn't have to score it. So you didn't see what the end result was of these qualitative analysis. You would just make observations. Hey, they don't have their stuff together, or they have a great culture. Where now you can actually see, or I can actually see the individual components of what a great culture, great workplace looks like, and a result.
Just on that, I think my teaching background really helped with that, because one of the things that you do as a teacher, and I was an English teacher, and I taught intermediate, so like grades 6 to 8. And one of the things that you have to do is figure out how you're going to grade people. And now what they do, if you have kids in school, is they have rubrics, which didn't exist when I was at school, or even when I was in teachers college, that basically say, if you want to get this grade, this is what it looks like. And so what I did, or what we did, is took that model and said, okay, we have to figure out how we're going to grade these people. So that's what it is. It's a grading system. So you have to, and when you think about a gym class, how do you grade people in a gym class? Because there are some people who are talented, some people who aren't talented, some people who are complete, who are trying really, really hard. They just, can't do it. So do you just give all the talented ones A's and then C's for everybody else? And on the base level, like the ninth grade level, you can't do that because everybody has to take the class. And you have to figure out a fair scoring mechanism. And it's all for anything that is behavior oriented. You have to figure out, well, what is the objective measure of that behavior? How can we figure out what that is? And that's what we've done, is basically created giant rubrics for every single question, which you got to, well, actually it's interesting, because what did you think about when you're scoring, you have to go back and revise the rubric.
Yeah. And that's the gentle nudge part. And that's probably the part that I didn't understand, how we adjusted the questions each year, and the scoring process was, you see somebody doing something above and beyond, then you have to change the range, or in some cases, if more people are doing it, you have to change the question. So it's always pushing the envelope a little bit gently, right? So the rubrics themselves were super helpful. I'd never used a rubric. I was maybe too late to the game. I think they started coming in after I was done university. But that was super helpful. It appealed to my mind. Like Mark himself, he has some good RAM, some random access memory, so he can remember everyone's response for a particular question. But as soon as I read, the fifth answer, I forget.
Well,
the
that gets to be a grind. Yeah, I can remember people's responses in different places in different years and things like that. But going through and scoring it is really kind of a world of its own, because you've gone through this interview process, and throughout that, you start mentally thinking, oh, I had a good interview with these people. They seem to be doing really well. And these other ones maybe haven't got their story as strong yet. You start to naturally sort of rank them in your head of who's doing well and who's kind of middle ground. And then you get into the scoring, where we do it very differently, where we look at all the answers to one particular question. And that's all of a sudden, it's like, okay, well, here's 80 different things that people are doing on this one question. How do I rank these? That's where that rubric comes in. And I find it completely necessary to not only have a rubric, but to pull out all of their answers and sort of boil it down to the basics of what they're doing. Because you get a lot of marketing speak, you get people trying to put their best foot forward, or they'll be describing something that you need to convert into a shorthand, because they'll be giving sort of their answer of something. And then you realize, oh, it's really the same as what these other people are doing, just with different wording. So I ended up this year, much more than in past years, just pulling all of those things out and creating a spreadsheet for every single one of them, so I could capture it all and then sort of rank them and then figure out the scores and then adjust the rubric based on that, so that I'm not stuck in that thing where everybody gets the same score, because they're all doing the same thing that was on last year's rubric. So it's a tough,
and everybody's
tough job
doing the same thing. We don't score it. It's no point. Everybody's going to get a 3 or a 5 on that. Then, why have it in there? It just kind of negates. Yeah. And that happened with technology last year. I think this year we scored it, right?
Yeah, we did start scoring it again with safety technology. We've had a couple of years of not scoring
and
it.
Environmental
came back last year after about 3 years of not being scored. So
like when you don't have anything to score, there you kind of have to kick out the question. But
and so my question for you related to that is, what was your experience sort of comparing the interview process with the scoring, and how did that scoring change your opinion of the interviews and how people were doing?
Yeah, I would say about 50, maybe 60% of the people that I thought were slam dunks turned out not to be. So for the viewers and listeners who don't understand the process, we divvy up the interviews into there's 4 of us did the interviews, And I would come away from an interview, and I think just like people can massage the message in text form, they can do it, verbally and by video too. And so I was maybe sold a bill of goods. And
Oh,
in some
you
cases,
were easy, man. You were easy.
Yeah, I was easy target. But yeah, I was proven wrong. So, but once the scoring process was done, and once it was all the answers were, quote unquote defensible, or the scores were defensible. My biggest thing was, okay, what are the drivers going to say? Because the ultimate floodgate is, or the hurdle is, did the drivers validate, how good these people are? And we've had in this particular year, we had lots of situations where the drivers did not validate. They were selling us on something. So that's the main thing. You have to be the phrase is best fleet to drive for. You have to, this has to be validated. It's a driver initiated program and, driver qualified program. So if you can't satisfy your drivers, you're not gonna, all those, great responses are for naught. So.
Yeah, well, it's also important to recognize that our job during the interview is to help them put their best foot forward. So we're kind of going through those things, doing our best to pull out their story, to pull out all of the things. And there's lots of cases where they have great things they just don't think to say, or it doesn't occur to them to talk much about it until you get in the interview and you pick a little bit up in some of their words, and then you realize, hang on, what's this about? You glossed over this, but tell me more. And so that helps.
We scrape the brain.
The brain scraping.
It's the brain scraping.
But then when you get to the scoring, we've got all of those cases where they've put their best foot forward, and we've got to put it up against each other. And what I find interesting is the way we do that scoring. And not only do we divvy up the interviews, but we divvy up the scoring as well. So we'll each have sort of a section that we're scoring. And you may be going through it and saying, wow, I'm finding this company is ending up getting really good scores in here when I wasn't expecting it. You get these dark horses that come out. And what's really fascinating is when we have a conversation afterwards and I say, these guys are really doing better than I thought they were going to. And somebody else is like, yeah, I'm finding that as well. They're really doing well. That's when you've got somebody who's going to sort of break through and pop into the top 20.
But I think it was funny because I remember during the interview process, Chris, you were always saying, oh, this company is great. This is awesome. And it'd be a company that we knew and who had gone through the process before. And you're like,
well, we'll see. We'll see how it shakes out.
And because you get to know the companies that you interview. And it's so different from the interview to the scoring. And people really do take a lot of them do take the interview very, very seriously and do a really good job at it. But the problem is that it doesn't matter how great you are. And like you said, it doesn't matter how great you are in the interview if the driver surveys aren't good.
Yeah, that's an important part.
And this is what I've said. I say this on the radio where drivers hear it a lot. I say the difference between being on the top 20 and not being on it is drivers. The driver surveys, man, if they are not good, then you're
dead in the water.
Great. Well, just one of the things that we're going to be doing with this podcast is over the course of the next 12 months, we're going to be breaking out each topic and highlighting a carrier and an executive from that carrier that has got that topic locked down or on the right path. And what I thought I'd do is just go through some of the main topics that we run through in the questionnaire and in the scoring process. So Jane, maybe just to start off with, in the HR strategy area, we ask about a carrier's diversity and inclusion efforts, and how are they doing with attracting females, ethnic minorities to their companies, keeping them, role equity, any unique or novel responses this year from that point of view that you can think of?
I think it's an interesting question because you cannot create good diversity and inclusion in one program or in 1 year. So this is something that takes years. I mean, I know of fleets that started 5 years ago with one program that was about attracting women. But that's not all of diversity, right? Like you can't, and when we score it, we only don't score only, oh, how many women drivers do you have? That's great. That is one part of it. But there are so many other parts of diversity that there's nothing that, not so much that I found that people were standing out so much as it's been going on for long enough now that it's not just women. So this is what was happening for the longest time. It was like diversity equals women, and which is fine. There's not that many women in trucking. They're, having 10% of your drivers be women. That's a good number. But I wanted, and I have notes, so you have to excuse, but I needed to use notes. But what, I have a couple of things. Some of the, there's, for the marketing stuff to attract diversity, one of the companies that I thought was really interesting was ACT. And they have a marketing campaign to attract drivers called I Am ACT. I read it and I think I Am Act, but it's I Am ACT. And what they're doing is they're using their own drivers and using different drivers who may be of a different ethnic origin or ethnicity or something like, or a woman, and they're actually telling, using video to tell the story in their own words, which is pretty typical for marketing. That's like some of the, the best marketing that's out there is use your own drivers, find the diversity within your own fleet and highlight that, because that is what's going to attract people. But what I am noticing is that more diversity is coming into play. So I know Garner Trucking, who's on the top 20, they have some really cool things going on with hearing impaired drivers and having support. So they actually brought in some help for the communication. Like they're not learning American Sign Language, but they have technology that's helping them. CAT, who isn't in the top 20, but they are part of a really interesting initiative in Quebec to bring up the number of women drivers to 10%. That's a province-wide
that's cool.
program, which I think is very interesting, that the government is actually, or the Canadian parts of the Canadian government are actually getting in on this. And I think that more of that would actually be really, really helpful. But I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and that one too with CAT, they have a very diverse, non-driver staff. And apart from their driver community, their non-driver staff are very diverse, lots of different ethnic backgrounds. So you can feel it when you're talking to them that it runs through the company.
And when you have that, when it is running through the company, it's a very different dynamic. And I agree, because leadership has to be diverse. Like the diversity efforts have to go all the way down, like start at the top, go all the way down, just like any other successful thing. But what I wanted to really comment on is the increase in LGBTQ. No one talked about it at all. And more often we're hearing about trans drivers. And there's a lot of that. That is like the biggest open secret in trucking, that the number of it's a great place for a trans person who wants to work alone, is having issues with, integrating into different jobs. It's a great environment if you can cultivate that. And so a lot of fleets have trans drivers and people who are making the transition while they're working at the trucking company, which I think is really, really cool. And just on that, I wanted to note, and this is something that we do in Best Fleets, is we get a lot of information from, society as well. We were aware, we were talking about millennials and the difficulty of working with millennials and blah, blah, blah. We were looking at that and looking at, how difficult it was and looking at the challenges. But now there's Gen Z. And what's very interesting there's been a study for Gen Z that 1 in 6 Gen Z adults are part of the LGBTQ spectrum.
Really? Okay.
Which I think is very, very interesting. But also that 50% of them don't think that gender is binary. So they are all very happy with it being on a spectrum. And I think that is going to be the next big thing in trucking.
Yeah,
because
that's coming.
as they start hiring Gen Zs or Gen Zs, for anybody who's watching this in the US, you're not going to just get, the odd trans driver. It's going to be,
a bunch of non-binary and
we had one company was talking about having their first non-binary person and how they were adapting to the use of the pronoun they. So I think that is fascinating, and that is going to be a really maybe not in the next year, but in the next 5, I would predict that we're going to see more and more of that, and more LGBT. The embrace of the LGBT community. I think trucking would do well to think about that, because if everybody is, if the youth of today are coming up and they don't think it's an issue and you do, you've got to disconnect.
You're not getting those people in your industry.
Yeah.
There's a block there. And so Mark, turn it over to you, staying in the HR strategy area. One of the big trigger words emotionally with you is when people say, and now it's becoming, one for me too, is when people kind of throw it over the fence and say, we have an open door policy, and that just solves everything. So I don't need to complete this questionnaire. We have an open door policy. I'm done. So tell me
it's copy
your thoughts
paste,
on that.
Right?
Yeah, copy paste.
Well, it is something that anybody who's heard me speak on the best weight subject
I know
since the beginning has heard me talk about it. So there's a few reasons why it kind of sticks in my craw. And one is that it just doesn't tell us anything. And for a while, I made the joke that every single company we've interviewed says they have an open door policy.
But they did.
And they probably do. But still, if everybody has this policy, then why am I bothering to ask? And they can't really tell you what it means or what they do that's different, other than to say, well, we have a true open door or real open door. There was one company that boasted we have no doors. We have a no door policy. We have no doors on our offices. And I'm like, man, they're taking it to the extreme.
Yeah.
But so it doesn't really tell us anything that's sort of manageable, and everybody's saying it. And I also think that that's not really what's going on. I mean, drivers can say that, and that's really helpful. But for the company to say, here's how it is, that doesn't really mean the same. Also, it's a very reactive type policy. It's somebody saying, well, I'm in my office, the door's open. If you got a problem, come and tell me, which is a whole lot different than going out and saying, hey, what do you think is good and bad about this company? What should we be changing here? That's a totally different approach. So we started looking at the companies and how they are proactive versus reactive, and sort of gauging that kind of thing and looking at all of the different things that they're doing. And as it turns out, a lot of the good companies, a lot of the ones that are doing very well in recent years, I know where they're coming from with the idea of open door policy, which is that I'm happy to have anybody come and talk to me. I'm happy to go and talk to anybody, regardless of the job title or the position. But they're realizing that as much as that philosophy is, it's okay for a driver to come and talk to the CEO. Okay, and that's good enough on its own. But the reality is that in a well-run company, the driver shouldn't need to. If the driver needs to come to the CEO, it's a sign of another problem. So the good companies, the ones that are doing very well in this area, aren't having that happen so much because they've got very effective management layers. So the driver doesn't need to go into the CEO's office, because mid-level management is taking care of any of the issues, finding out what the driver concerns are and dealing with them. And the CEO and other executive team are going out to the drivers and doing town halls and doing polling and all this other stuff to find out what's going on proactively. So that's really changed. And we've really seen a dramatic shift in that in the past few years. So it doesn't set me off the way it did in the past. I also recognize that when we hear it now, it's mostly people that are coming into the program for the first time. And I recognize that a lot of it comes from this being fairly new. The idea of a conversation about the HR side of the business is fairly new in trucking. When we came into the industry 15 years ago, nobody was talking about the HR side of it. So
no HR departments.
There wasn't HR departments. There are a lot of things that are sort of standard practice that we put in the questionnaire in the beginning are just now becoming commonplace in trucking. So it's an industry that traditionally hasn't had a lot of maturity in the HR function. So they don't really have the language to describe all the things that they do to make a good workplace. So I think a big part of that, kind of recognizing now that a big part of that in the early days is they didn't have the words. They didn't know how to describe what they're doing or how to tell that story. And that's getting a lot better now. The industry is getting a lot better at talking about what it does to create a good workplace and what it does that is specific to the company versus just using catchphrases like, we treat drivers like family, you're a name, line, number, and we got an open door policy. Well, I mean, everybody says that. Insert company name here, they all have that. So what specifically are you doing and how does that manifest and what does that look like for a driver and all that sort of thing? So,
but I think, like, in fairness to you, people weren't doing anything. I mean, that was a problem. They weren't asking drivers anything.
Yeah, it used to be that the way to get top score in that question about total workplace environment, all you had to do was say, we actually ask our drivers.
Yeah.
That was the way to get perfect scores, is say we ask our drivers, because so few were.
Yeah.
But now
things have changed.
Well, yeah, it has changed a lot. We've got this.
And part of it is because we've said, you can't just do that.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just have an open door policy and wait for the problems to come to you. You have to go and look for them. If you want to, do you want to wait for a problem to get big enough that someone feels like they have to tell you? That's terrible.
Mm-hmm. And how about all the people that aren't at that point yet or don't want to say something?
Or who just leave.
Yeah. But there's also a lot more tools to make it easier now. So there's a lot more survey tools. Technology helps with that. It's easy to do surveys of drivers and to coordinate town halls. And you've got Facebook groups and a variety of ways for people to collaborate and get feedback from each other. So it's a lot easier for them to do that. But yeah, it is one of those things that's become kind of a sort of an internal joke, but do they have an open door policy?
Yeah.
Yeah. They have open doors.
Well, this is good, but I'm not sure. They don't have an open door policy.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, one of the things I think that's really good as well in terms of that is the people doing podcasts using Facebook, and not just for recruiting, but actually to have a conversation with drivers. Like those are free, easy to do. Like especially Facebook, that not everybody is doing. And everybody uses Facebook for recruiting, but not everybody is using it for conversations, and they should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. Moving on to probably the biggest elephant in the room for 2020, which everyone is aware of, COVID. I was actually surprised at kind of the lack of response, even though it well publicized that drivers were are frontline essential workers. It could have been just people were over it by the time the questionnaires came out. But one in particular, on a positive note, we had a company, Challenger Motor Freight, and they had put together a pandemic task force and action plan in the fall of 2019, and obviously, someone there had a crystal ball, and it was like, all they had to do was open this book, and they had a portal for it, and it worked really well for them. But obviously, a lot of carriers didn't have the fortune of having that kind of plan. I would guess, we don't know for sure, but I would guess that less than 5% actually have a pandemic response plan. But did you guys have any thoughts about that feeling that I had, that there was kind of a lack of anything above and beyond?
I will sort of just comment on the pandemic plan. And I think it's probably a lower percentage even than what you're suggesting, because I remember being very interested in doing the Best Fleets interview with Herb Transport last fall, because they were the only company that I had remembered interviewing in the past that in the question about natural disasters, they actually had a pandemic response plan as well. So I was very eager.
And that was because of SARS, because SARS was an issue in 2002.
Yeah.
And so that they've had it since they developed it then, and they've had it since then.
So I was very curious to interview them and see how did it work? How well was your
How
plan?
did it?
They said it worked pretty good. They had to tweak
Okay.
a few things, and there was definitely some things that happened nobody was really expecting. But by and large, it worked pretty well for them. So that was, I found that very interesting that they had put that plan together, and it had actually worked pretty well. There's obviously some things that need to be adjusted. That old adage about no plan survives contact with the enemy, and COVID being the enemy, it's going to throw a wrench into the plan. But just having it there, it really paid off for them. I think the same as what happened with the Challenger. So that really stuck out for me. As far as the scoring, you did some work on that.
I did. There was a range of people doing kind of the give them masks and hand sanitizer, mask, PPE and hand sanitizer, which was kind of the lowest score. Mm-hmm. And then there were, to get the highest score, you had to kind of go above and beyond. Now, people talked a lot about giving them food and having meals and that kind of stuff. But to get the highest mark, you actually had to give emotional support. So the highest mark actually went to those companies that said, we put in a program to actually to make sure that the drivers were contacted on a regular basis to see how they were. Mm-hmm. And I think, I may have scored that. Mm-hmm. But I thought that, you can throw a masks and hand sanitizer at everybody, but you're missing that whole human part of it. Mm-hmm. If you do all the things that you're supposed to do, but you're also sending all these people out. And last March and April, you were sending them out into the unknown. People didn't know what was going to happen. Anxiety. We didn't know what. Yeah, like the mental issue of like the stress. Like I cannot believe I was stressed enough, and I was sitting at home, and I thought somehow COVID was going to come into my house.
Come to the walls.
Yeah, we had.
You must have thought that was fun.
We had one person, an executive with the carrier, mention. And I thought it was a pretty awesome response. Is he said, regardless if they're introverts or not, drivers, the driving community, they say, has a higher percentage of introverts. There's a lot of loneliness there, and what COVID did was amplify that loneliness factor. Mm-hmm. And that was their response. Is they provided a hotline, a third-party hotline, plus they put together a team, communication team, to address those kind of issues. So. Well, there you have it. Our first official Best Fleets podcast episode is in the books after months of planning. I want to thank Mark and Jane for taking the time for this recording, as well as sharing their insights. As mentioned at the beginning, this is part 1 of 2 of a longer conversation. On the next one, we're going to be talking more about driver efficiency technology, the process carriers use for implementing and actually selecting that technology, and also driver coaching, mentoring situations and programs. And finally, shipper-carrier relationships, how that is evolving over time. So until next time, please subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. And until then, keep improving. Thank you.